The heat of a July evening enveloped the small town in central Michigan like a blanket. The air shook over the asphalt, and the few passers-by on the street moved slowly, as if trying to stretch out the last warm rays of the day. The Harris house, with its neat lawn and bright flowers on the porch, looked as spotless on the outside as it did on the cover of a Happy Life magazine. But behind the tightly closed doors lurked something you wouldn't see from the road. Susan stood in the kitchen and washed dishes. Her hands moved mechanically. Plate, sponge, water, plate again. From the next room came the sound of the TV, but she did not listen to it. Her thoughts were somewhere far away, outside these walls. Every night the same ritual repeated itself. Ted came home. They ate dinner in silence, like two strangers who happened to be at the same table. Then he sat down in front of the television, and Susan went to the kitchen to clean up and erase the traces of their silent evening. Ted was home early today, and that alerted her at once. He didn't say where he'd been or why he'd interrupted his workday so abruptly. Instead, he walked straight into the kitchen and, without looking at her, began pulling vegetables out of the refrigerator. Susan felt the tension in the room grow thick, like musty air in a basement. She finished with the dishes and cautiously turned around. Ted was standing at the table, slicing onions quickly and confidently. His hands moved with a precise, uncluttered motion. Drops of sweat glistened on his forehead, but he didn't seem to notice them. On ordinary days, he was always late at work, sometimes late into the night, and Susan was used to his absence. But today he was here, and that alarmed her. Kyle, Ted's son from his first marriage, had shown up at their house only a week ago. He stood on the threshold of the kitchen, watching Susan and his father with the silent curiosity she was beginning to hate. His clear blue eyes, so much like Ted's, looked directly at her, and Susan felt exposed. It seemed to her that this young man saw everything she had so carefully hidden for years: her fear, her frustration, her despair. "Ted," she said gently, hoping to soften the atmosphere, but her voice sounded too quiet. He didn't react, continuing to chop the onions as if it were the most important thing in the world. Kyle took a step forward and leaned against the door jamb. "Can I help you?" he asked, turning to his father but looking at Susan. Ted glanced briefly at his son, but only nodded his head. Susan furtively watched their interaction, noticing how Kyle tried to win his father's affection, but his efforts were met with a cold wall of indifference each time. It reminded her of how she herself had once tried to find common ground with Ted, but had failed. When Kyle left the kitchen, Susan felt a slight relief, as if the tense string inside her had loosened a little. She glanced at Ted, but he was still avoiding her gaze, concentrating on his food. It was as if time had slowed. Each sound of a knife cutting an onion seemed louder and more painful. Kyle sat on the porch and breathed in the warm evening air. Susan looked exhausted, and he felt uneasy about intruding into their quiet but clearly dysfunctional world. It seemed to him that something was wrong here, but he didn't know how to put it into words. Her eyes always looked past him, as if she was in another place, in another life from which she could find no way back. Until a few days ago, he had been sure that this vacation would be boring and monotonous, but meeting Susan had changed his outlook. She wasn't what he'd imagined a stepmother to be like. There was something appealing about her, something warm and real, like a flame fading beneath a layer of ashes. Kyle wanted to see her smile again, the same smile he'd noticed once at dinner when they'd discussed his college plans. But today she looked aloof and lost again, just as she had when he'd first arrived. Meanwhile, across town, Detective Alan Brooks was finishing up his workday. With a cigarette in his hand, he stood at the window and looked out at the streets flooded with the orange light of the setting sun. Emily Johnson, his new partner, immersed in her reports, cast a brief glance at him but said nothing. Their last case, involving the disappearance of a local woman, was closed, but Alan felt like he'd missed something. He hated that feeling, like a splinter he couldn't get out. "Emily, do you ever feel like something is going wrong, but you can't figure out what it is?" he asked finally, turning to her. Emily looked up and shrugged. "In our work? Almost always," she answered, keeping her eyes on the papers. Alan grinned and looked out the window again. The city was sinking into night, and it seemed to him that somewhere out there, outside the window, A new story was already brewing that would soon lead them to another case. But for now, all was quiet. Summer days in the small town flowed slowly like thick honey, spreading hot streams across the asphalt. Susan stood on the back porch, watching the sun slowly sink behind the treetops. Her shoulders relaxed slightly as the door slammed behind her, and familiar footsteps fell silent somewhere in the house. Ted retreated into the study, leaving her alone in the warm evening air. Kyle appeared silently, like a shadow. She knew he was there, sensed his presence long before she heard his voice. "You're here," he said softly, as if afraid to break the fragile silence. Susan turned around and met his gaze. There was something in those blue eyes that made her forget everything else in the world. She nodded briefly, and he stepped closer, as if succumbing to an invisible force that was pulling him toward her. They stood side by side, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. Her hand trembled when he touched her gently. It was almost weightless, like the flight of a butterfly, but it meant more to Susan than all the long years of her marriage to Ted. She squeezed Kyle's hand, as if afraid that if she let go, it would all be just a dream. They met in secret when Ted was away on business or working late. They were brief, stolen moments, but for Susan, they were a breath of fresh air. She felt as if she were alive again with Kyle. But with it came the realization that their relationship was a dangerous game, and the stakes were too high. The sun was below the horizon when Ted returned home. He walked into the house and went straight into the study without undressing. Susan knew what it meant. He was nervous, he'd been sullen, irritable for the past few days. At first, she'd thought it was his work, but now she was catching more and more of his suspicious glances. Ted had never been soft, but now there was something new about him, a fierce insistence, as if he were trying to get at something that eluded him. He watched her every move, wondering where she went, what she did. Even Kyle could feel the pressure. Ted began to ask him a lot of questions that hid his distrust. The evening came quietly and quietly again. Susan sat in the living room and tried to read a book, but couldn't concentrate. The tension in the house was becoming more palpable by the minute. When Ted entered the room, she almost dropped the book. "Where's Kyle?" he asked, leaning against the door jamb. "In his room, I think," Susan answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Ted paused, giving her a long, hard look, but said nothing. She could see his jaw clenched, as if he were holding back the urge to ask something. He silently turned and walked out of the room, leaving her in silence. Kyle was sitting in his room when the door creaked quietly, and Susan peeked inside. Her eyes glittered in the dim nightlight, and her lips were tightly pressed together, as if she were trying not to break into a whisper. "You should be more careful," she said, closing the door behind her. "He's starting to suspect something." Kyle nodded, but there was no alarm in his gaze. He seemed in control of the situation, that everything was under control. But Susan knew that Ted wasn't the type to let suspicion go as soon as it appeared. And the more Kyle reassured her, the more her anxiety grew. They stood in a cramped room where everything seemed too close. His shoulder next to hers, his arm barely touching her waist. She felt everything inside freeze as he leaned closer. Their lips met, and the world disappeared for a moment. But in the back of her mind, the same fear still battled. How long could they continue this game? Across town, Alan Brooks and Emily Johnson sat in the police office, staring at the files spread out before them. The disappearance of the woman they had been informed of yesterday had kept Alan on his toes. Everything seemed strange. No leads, no witnesses, no motive. The woman had simply left the house and never returned. Her husband claimed she had no enemies, but something about his behavior seemed wrong to Alan. Emily absent-mindedly leafed through the reports, throwing glances at her partner. He was absorbed in his own thoughts, and she didn't want to distract him, but she was also preoccupied with the case. Her intuition told her that something was wrong here, but they had nothing but idle speculation. "Do you think she just ran away?" Emily asked quietly, not lifting her eyes from the papers. "Maybe," Alan answered, but his voice sounded uncertain. "But I've seen enough of these cases to know that if something seems too simple, it's probably more complicated than you think." Emily nodded, but there was still doubt in her eyes. They knew they had to dig deeper, but so far they didn't have any strings to pull. At the Harris house, the situation was heating up every day. Ted became even more suspicious and tense, his questions more direct and his glances harder. Susan and Kyle were living like a powder keg. Every move they made could be the final step to shattering their illusion of safety. One night while Ted was in his office, Susan walked out onto the back porch and saw Kyle there. He was sitting on the steps with his head bowed and staring into the darkness. She walked over and sat quietly beside him. He reached out to take her palm, and she let him. In that moment, it seemed to them that the world stood still and nothing else mattered. But there were dim lights burning outside the windows, and Susan knew Ted was somewhere close by. Susan sat at her desk and tried to focus on the cup of coffee in front of her. The morning seemed normal, but tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Ted came home late at night, went straight to the study, and didn't say a word to her. She could hear his heavy footsteps echoing down the empty hallway, but she dared not go out to meet him. Now that the day was breaking, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The door to the kitchen swung open with force and Ted stepped inside, his face red with anger. Kyle sat at the table across from Susan and straightened up warily as his father threw him a glare full of rage. Susan froze, her fingers frantically gripping the handle of the cup. "Do you think I don't notice anything?" Ted almost shouted, his voice trembling. He stepped toward the table, grabbing Susan's wrist so that her coffee spilled onto the countertop. "I know what you two are up to here." Kyle rose from his seat, but Susan threw him a warning glance. She realized that any word or movement now would only add fuel to the fire. "Ted, calm down, you've got it all wrong," she finally said, trying to keep her voice steady. But it was as if he didn't hear her. His gaze was glassy, almost insane, and she could see him clench his jaws to a crunch. "Did you misunderstand?" he interjected, smirking ironically. "Do you really think I'm an idiot?" He abruptly let go of her hand and turned and walked out of the kitchen, slamming the door loudly. Susan remained seated, feeling a cold sweat break out on her back. Kyle walked over to her, his face pale. "We need to do something," he said quietly, leaning closer to her. "He's not going to calm down." But Susan only shook her head in silence. She knew Ted too well to hope this would just end like this. He would dig in, he would push until he broke them both. A few days passed. Ted disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. Susan didn't know what to think. This wasn't the first time he had left without warning, but this time something was different. Usually he left at least a short note or called the next day. Now not a word, not a hint as to where he'd gone. Kyle had noticed the change too. He was showing up at the house less and less, preferring to spend his time in the garage or backyard, where Ted's shadow couldn't reach them. But Susan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Ted was watching them, even now that he wasn't around. "Do you think he'll come back?" Kyle asked one day, as they sat on the porch, looking out at the empty driveway in front of the house. "I don't know," Susan answered quietly. She tried to speak calmly, but she was seething inside. She knew that if Ted came back, it would mean the end of their shaky world. Every night, Susan awoke to the slightest rustle, listening to the silence of the house, fearing she was about to hear Ted's footsteps in the hallway. But as the days went by, he never showed up. Neighbors began to ask questions, but she waved them away. "He's away on business. He'll be back soon." She had to smile, to maintain the illusion of normality, but inside she was torn by fear. She knew that sooner or later everything would come to light. It had been 5 days since Ted had disappeared. Susan was beginning to get used to his absence when there was a knock on the door. It was Alan Brooks, the detective she'd encountered on the doorstep. Behind him stood Emily Johnson, with a notebook and a serious expression on her face. "Mrs. Harris," Alan began, looking her over carefully. "We received a report of a body found in the woods nearby. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Susan felt her heart skip a beat, but she just nodded and invited them in. Everything inside her was screaming, but she couldn't show the slightest sign of excitement. She knew that her every movement, every glance would be scrutinized. Alan and Emily sat down at the table, took out their notes and began to ask questions. Formal, one by one, without a hint of suspicion. but Susan could feel their gazes burning her from the inside out. She answered clearly, trying not to hurry or jump from topic to topic, but the sweat on her palms betrayed her inner tension. "When was the last time you saw your husband?" Alan asked, keeping his eyes on her face. "A week ago," she answered, trying to remain calm. "He was away on business, just like before. I didn't know he was missing." Emily made a note in her notebook, her eyes scrutinizing Susan's expression. Kyle, who was standing at the door listening to this conversation, kept his eyes on his stepmother. Late that night, after the detectives had left, Susan sank down on the couch. She felt drained, as if all the energy had been squeezed out of her in those few hours. Kyle sat down next to her, taking her hand gently. "We'll get through this," he said, looking into her eyes, but he didn't sound as sure as he had before. Susan nodded silently, but she found it hard to believe his words. At that moment, something flashed outside the window, and she flinched. It seemed to her that someone was standing in the darkness watching them, but it was only a tree, its branches moved by the night wind. But they both knew it was the calm before the storm. Detective Alan Brooks squatted down and scrutinized the crime scene. Ted Harris's car was parked on the side of the forest road with the driver's door open. Forensics had already lifted prints and collected evidence, but Alan knew the devil lurked in the details. The glove compartment was upside down, stuff was lying on the floor, the seats were cut open, and the driver's door glass was shattered. It looked like the assailant had been frantically searching the car, but there was something too neat about the mess. Emily Johnson stood nearby, watching the forensics team work around the car. She noticed Alan lingering too long by the torn seats and decided to approach. "Did you find something?" she asked. "Look at the cuts." Alan pointed to the cuts in the upholstery. "This doesn't look like a random attack. It's too symmetrical, like someone wanted it to look like a robbery." Emily frowned, crouching down next to her. She ran her fingers along the edge of the cut, feeling that the fabric had been torn with care and effort. "Do you think it's staged?" she asked, her gaze focused on the seats. "Yes," Alan nodded. "And I think whoever did it knew how to create the appearance of chaos. But why?" He looked around the forest. Nearby, he could see tracks that led from the car deep into the thicket where Ted's body had been found. But these tracks were strange, too smooth and distinct for panicked flight. Susan sat in the kitchen, looking tiredly at her hands. The silence in the house pressed down on her like a weight. Since Ted's disappearance, her life had become a wait for the inevitable. She tried to stay calm, especially in front of Kyle, who knew nothing about what had happened in the woods. Kyle walked into the kitchen, stretching, and sat down across from her. "Are the detectives coming again?" he asked, staring at the table. Susan nodded and pretended not to be bothered. "Yes, they want to ask a few more questions," she said, trying to sound calm. He looked up at her, his eyes full of confusion. For Kyle, all of this was unexpected and incomprehensible. He truly believed that his father was away on business and would be back soon. Susan knew she shouldn't give away her true emotions. When Detectives Alan and Emily reappeared on the doorstep, Susan did her best to look welcoming. She invited them into the living room, trying to remain confident even though everything was trembling inside. Kyle sat next to her, his shoulders tense, but he still didn't understand the depth of the situation. Alan sat down across from them and, without distraction, got straight to the point. "We found your husband's car on the forest road," he said, watching Susan's reaction. "A car?" Susan acted surprised. "He was away on a business trip. I didn't know his car was here." Kyle turned his head towards Susan, a look of bewilderment on his face. "You didn't tell me anything," he said quietly. "I just found out," Susan replied quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Detectives, are you sure it's his car?" "Absolutely," Alan said firmly, keeping his eyes on her. "But we're more interested in why it was abandoned in the middle of the woods and what happened to your husband." Emily, listening to the conversation, watched Kyle carefully. He looked confused and depressed, but there was sincerity in his eyes. He really didn't know anything about what was going on, and that made her focus on Susan. "When was the last time you saw Mr. Harris?" Emily asked, pointing her notebook at Susan. "About a week ago," she answered quickly. "He said he was leaving on business, so I didn't ask any questions. He did that a lot." Emily nodded, making notes. But something about Susan's demeanor alarmed her. The woman seemed overly confident in her answers, but every now and then her gaze darted restlessly around the room. After the detectives left, Susan sank down on the couch, feeling her strength finally leaving her. Kyle walked over to her and sat down next to her. "Why do you look so scared?" he asked quietly. "Daddy was always gone, wasn't he?" Susan tried to smile, but her voice trembled. "Yes, of course, it's just all too sudden," she mumbled. Kyle nodded, but his anxiety never left him. He didn't understand why Susan was acting like she was hiding something important, but she squeezed his hand tighter and tried to pretend that everything was all right. Outside, the day was drawing to a close, and Susan knew that night would bring more nightmares. She realized, every time the detectives showed up on her doorstep, they were getting closer to a clue. And even though Kyle remained in the dark, she knew it wouldn't last long. Early morning in the woods seemed unnaturally quiet when Detectives Alan Brooks and Emily Johnson arrived on the scene. Ted Harris's car was parked half-buried in the bushes by the side of the forest road. From the outside, it looked like it had been attacked. Broken glass, ripped seats, the glove compartment gutted. But inside, everything was too orderly, as if someone had deliberately created the appearance of chaos. "It looks staged," Alan said, eyeing the car carefully. "It's too neat for a regular attack. If it was a robbery, why were the valuables left behind?" Emily squatted by the open driver's door and touched the torn seat upholstery with her fingers. "The cuts were made smoothly in one motion," she said. "It didn't look like panic, more like an attempt to find something or just make a mess. Forensics have been investigating the scene thoroughly and have already found some interesting clues." Me. Jenkins approached the detectives with the results of the initial examination. "There were traces of sleeping pills in Ted's blood," he said, showing the printouts of the tests. "Very high concentrations. He was completely unconscious before his throat was cut." "That would explain the lack of signs of a struggle," Alan said thoughtfully. "But why was he brought here in the woods?" "Perhaps to hide the murder scene," Emily said, looking at the blood stains on the ground. "Look, the blood spilled right here. He was pulled out of the car and killed on the ground." They looked down the path that led away from the car and into the woods. The soft ground had the distinct footprints of a woman's medium-sized boot. They led from the car to the highway and stopped on the hard ground by the side of the road. Alan and Emily looked at each other. "She got out of the car and walked," Alan concluded, "probably to avoid leaving the car in plain sight or to avoid the surveillance cameras." "That's odd, by the way," Alan muttered, glancing around the cabin. "If the glass had been broken from the outside with the door closed, the shards should have gotten inside the car." Emily, who was standing nearby, frowned and came closer. "You're right," she said, nodding. "But here, all the splinters are on the outside. That means the door was open when the glass was broken." Alan hesitated, rubbing his chin. "If the killer was really trying to stage a robbery," he began slowly, "why open the door first? It doesn't make sense. It was clearly done to avoid getting the shards inside." Emily picked up one of the shards and examined it in the light. "That means whoever broke the glass knew what they were doing," she concluded. "It wasn't a panic attack, but rather a deliberate attempt to make it look like a robbery." "And that points again to Susan," Alan added quietly. She had carefully thought out how she wanted it to look, but she had missed such a small detail. Meanwhile, Susan stood in the kitchen of her house, nervously clutching a cup of coffee. Ever since Ted had disappeared, her life had become a game of survival. She carefully prepared for each visit from the detectives, but knew that each time it could be her last chance to hide the truth. When Alan and Emily showed up at her door again, Susan tried to look calm, but inside her heart was racing. Kyle, who was sitting on the couch, looked up as they entered. "We're here to ask you some more questions, Mrs. Harris," Alan said, looking directly at her. "Of course," she replied with a strained smile, inviting them into the living room. Emily noticed right away that Kyle looked tense. His hands shook as he tried to hold the phone steady. He still believed that his father was away on business and would be back soon. Susan tried to maintain that illusion, but each day became more difficult. "Mr. Harris," Emily addressed him, sitting down across from him. "When was the last time you spoke to your father?" "A week ago," Kyle mumbled, avoiding her gaze. "He said he had important things to do." Emily took note of his words without looking away from his face. He looked sincere, but she could hear a note of uncertainty in his voice. "And you, Mrs. Harris?" Alan turned to Susan. "Do you also say that you have not seen him since that moment?" "Yes," Susan answered calmly. "He often left without warning. It was nothing new to us." But Alan noticed the trembling in her hands. Her story was too confident, too rehearsed. He knew that murderers often made mistakes at this stage, and he was prepared for Susan to stumble over details. Forensics had already examined Susan's seized belongings in the lab. There were microscopic traces of blood on her shoes that matched the samples found in the woods. But the most important piece of evidence was analyzing the geolocation of her phone. "We found breaks in her phone's location records," the technician said, showing the data. "For 3 hours overnight, the connection was lost, but then the signal reappeared near her home." "She turned off her phone to create an alibi," Emily noted. "But why didn't she think about the cameras along the road?" "Maybe she relied on the darkness," Alan answered, "but that's not enough to cover her tracks completely." In addition, the detectives discovered that Susan had bought 2 packs of sleeping pills from different pharmacies under different names. This heightened their suspicions. They now had motive, circumstantial evidence, and inconsistencies in testimony. When the detectives showed up at Susan's house again, she realized this was no longer a routine interrogation. This time they came in with a search warrant and decided to look into everything thoroughly. Kyle sat on the couch, looking confused at his stepmother, who was trying to stay calm. "Mrs. Harris, we have reason to believe that you had something to do with your husband's death," Alan said firmly. Susan took a deep breath and tried to smile. "It's ridiculous. It's not my fault," she said, but her voice trembled. Emily noticed this and knew at once that Susan was on the verge of a breakdown. Her mask of calm was beginning to fray at the seams. "We found traces of your shoes at the crime scene," Alan continued. "We also have records of your purchase of sleeping pills and your whereabouts that night." Kyle turned pale at this point, not understanding what this had to do with his stepmother. "What's going on?" he asked, but Susan didn't answer. Now that all the evidence was against her, the only thing left was a confession. Susan Harris was sitting at the kitchen table when detectives Alan Brooks and Emily Johnson entered her home for the last time. She greeted them with her usual strained smile, but Alan's look told her that this time was different. "We know what you've done, Mrs. Harris," Alan said in a steady, calm voice. "We know that your husband's murder wasn't a random attack." Kyle stood in the corner of the room, his face as pale as chalk. He didn't realize what was happening, but he had a premonition of the worst. Susan tried to hold herself together, gathering the remnants of her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about, detective," she said quietly, trying to look calm. Emily, who was standing behind Alan, picked up the clipboard and showed her the notes. "We found your footprints at the crime scene, Susan. Traces of your shoes in the woods, traces of blood on your boots, records of you buying sleeping pills in the days before Ted disappeared. And that's just a fraction of what we've collected." Her voice was soft but firm. "You planned this carefully, but you made mistakes." Susan glanced at Kyle, who was staring at her, his eyes widening in horror. She realized they knew everything. There was no point in pretending anymore. "You don't understand anything," her voice trailed off. "I did it for us, Kyle. For our love." Alan watched the scene, waiting to see what would happen next. Susan suddenly lunged forward and grabbed Kyle's hand, her fingers clawing at it as if her life depended on it. "Kyle, we can leave right now!" she shouted in desperation. "We have a chance! You have to understand! It was the only way we could be together! He would never let us go!" Kyle wrenched his hand away and took a step back, his face contorted in pain. Did you kill him?" he whispered. "You killed my father for this? For us?" Tears ran down his cheeks. He shook his head slowly, as if trying to convince himself that it was all just a bad dream. "I loved you, Susan, but you destroyed everything we had," he said, backing toward the door. "You killed my father for money. For yourself." Susan stood thunderstruck, watching Kyle walk away. She tried to shout something after him, but only a hoarse groan escaped her throat. Alan stepped forward and gently cuffed her. "Susan Harris, you are under arrest for the murder of your husband, Ted Harris," he said, tightening the metal bracelets around her wrists. The last scene played out in the stifling silence of the police station. Susan sat on the edge of the hard bunk in her cell, staring at one spot in front of her. Kyle stood at the bars, his face contorted in pain. He didn't look her in the eye, but she knew he was there. "Kyle," she whispered, clinging to the bars. "Please, I'm so sorry. I did everything for us." But he didn't answer. Tears streamed down his cheeks. He slowly turned away and walked away, leaving her in the emptiness of her prison. Later, as Alan and Emily sat in his office, they were going over the documents related to the case. "Love. Sometimes it can be more destructive than hate," Alan said, leaning back in his chair. Susan thought she was doing it for love, but it was really a lust for power and control. Emily looked at the pictures of Kyle and Susan. "Sometimes people do terrible things when they think they're fighting for something important," she said quietly. "But in the end, all that's left is ruined lives." Alan nodded. The case had come to an end, but there was a bitter residue in their hearts. Sometimes, to find the truth, you have to destroy the worlds people are trying so desperately to build.